Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit statements for the record from U.S. Right to Know, Open the Books, America First Legal, Frontiers of Freedom, and Dr. Alina Chan.
Without objection.
So just in the last few minutes, Dr. Gary has told us that this couldn't have come from bats. It had to go through an intermediate host. That may well be true, but arguing against that is they tested 90,000 some odd animals, and there is no animal host that's been found. But what he also doesn't tell you is the animal host could be a laboratory animal. It could be passed serially through that, and that's one way of quickly adapting and pushing natural selection to adapt a virus towards humans. Dr. Alina Chan has written extensively about this, how this virus didn't show up clunky and poorly transmissible. This virus showed up immediately very transmissible in humans as if it had been pre-adapted in a lab. Dr. Ebright, Dr. Gary tells us that he's wedded to the scientific method and that he considered all the different possibilities in proximal origins. And I know you're a professor, and I'm assuming you've been the senior author on many papers. I assume that you teach your younger researchers what is good scientific method and not good scientific method. In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Gary and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces and editorials. So it was an opinion piece. The authors were stating their opinion. But that opinion was not well-founded. In March of 2020, there was no basis to state that as a conclusion, as opposed to simply being a hypothesis. Moreover, we know that compelling evidence has been presented as a result of congressional inquiry in the House that 4 of the authors of that paper, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Rambeau, in their private communications, show clearly that they knew the conclusion that they stated in that article was invalid. So, in terms of what I would tell a younger scientist I would be mentoring, I would tell a younger scientist that you do not state a conclusion without evidence, even in an opinion piece in a scientific journal. And you never, under any circumstances in a scientific journal, state conclusions that you know to be unsound. That represents scientific misconduct. It represents scientific misconduct up to and including fraud. And the paper in question, the Proximal Origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction. 2 requests, one in 2023 and one in 2024, were submitted by teams of scientists to the journal in question, to the journal editors, asking them to add an editorial expression of concern and to initiate a review for retraction of the article.
I know of no other example in modern scientific history or publications where a publication has come forward pronouncing with such authority that the lab leak is implausible, it is not a laboratory construct, while privately saying, this is no friggin' conspiracy theory, it looks like it did, I'm 90-10, I'm 50-50. But no doubt in the paper. In fact, we know that it went back and forth with Dr. Fauci and with editors who say, we want the statements to be stronger. We want the conclusions to be stronger. That was actually coming from Nature at the time. We want you to doctor it up and even be more strong because we're making a political point here. That's where we should have known we were off track, that these people were politicians and that they were pushing an idea because, as Dr. Collins finally admitted in one of the emails, this is about the business of science with China. This will disturb our relations with China if anybody questions this. Dr. Quay, the idea that this came from the fish market, I thought had been discredited by virtually all of scientists. Now, I'm really surprised it's still being presented here. I know that the Chinese, the CDC, George Gao over there, basically said that they no longer consider it. And actually, if you think about it from their perspective, we're not sure if we can trust them. But at the same time, the Chinese, if they would rather have it come from a lab or the market, I think would choose the market over the lab. If anything, they would be, if we were going to think they were dishonest, would be dishonest towards saying, hey, we found some animals. But if you could review stepwise, just a little bit slower, some of the evidence for why it's not there, the amount of animals tested, the animal handlers compared to SARS-1, but also the idea of this genetic diversity that, when SARS-1 came about the first time, I think it tried hundreds of times because these animal viruses don't infect humans well in the beginning. It tried hundreds of times over and over again. And even in the end, SARS-1 didn't transmit between humans very well. That's why containment worked. And that's why quarantine worked, because it wasn't very infectious. But go through a little bit, step by step, the evidence of why anybody still maintaining that it came from the market is misguided.
Sure. I mean, let me agree with Dr. Gary about SARS-1 being a spillover, and let me elaborate a little bit. There were 11 cities, 11 markets, 3 different lineages, and a 30 nucleotide difference among the initial cases and patients, which approximates about a year of posterior diversity, as it's called. SARS-2, of course, it's either in one market or it's in no markets. There's no other proposal for a market origin from it. 457 animals were tested in the market. 0 were found to be infected. SARS-1, 92 animals, 100% infected. The vendors, the wildlife vendors in SARS-1 were all infected. We have 10 vendors here. None of them are infected. One vendor had bamboo rats from southern China, where the backbone comes from. He wasn't infected. His animals weren't infected. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. So it really, as Dr. Anderson said, it's one jump from one animal to one human. The most likely place that happens is in a laboratory. And again, to be clear, when you say an animal, it could be a petri dish. It could be animal cells in a petri dish. The question of where the origins came from is the question of where the animal is. And they've tested 96 animals in nature, and they've tested 0 animals at Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where we need to look.
Thank you. I'll reserve the rest for a second round.
Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Chair Peters and Ranking Member Paul,